On the 1st of June 1891, a man stood in the Royal Courts of Justice in London and lost everything he had. Not his money. He had married into a great deal of that, an American fortune, and he would marry it formally the very next morning, in a small ceremony that read less like a wedding than a retreat from the field. What he lost was harder to name and impossible to get back. He lost his name. By the time the jury filed back in, he was already, in the only sense that mattered to a man of his world, finished. And the people who had finished him were not his enemies. They were the friends he had dined with, hunted with, and gambled beside for 20 years. His name was Sir William Gordon Cumming. He was 42, a lieutenant colonel in the Scots Guards, a baronet with a Scottish estate, a soldier who had served in South Africa, Egypt, and the Sudan. He was tall, vain, openly successful with women, and close enough to the future King of England to lend the prince his London house when the prince had use for it. All of that, the rank, the friendships, the standing built over a lifetime, came apart over a card game played after dinner on 2 unremarkable autumn evenings, for winnings that would not have troubled any man in the room. He took £228 across the 2 nights. For that, the world he lived in closed its doors and never opened them again. To feel how that was possible, you have to set aside nearly everything you assume about what a game is. To us, a parlor game is the lowest stakes thing in the house, the thing you play because the television is off. You can cheat at cards with your cousins on a wet afternoon, and the worst that happens is someone overturns the board. The idea that a hand of cards could erase a grown man's entire life, permanently, with no crime charged and no court verdict needed, sounds not just harsh but deranged. And yet that is exactly what happened, and the men who did it were not cruel or unusual. They were behaving correctly, by the rules of their kind. The madness, when you look closely, is not in their cruelty. It is in the code itself. Begin with the room. In September 1890, the Prince of Wales, Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, then a heavy, restless man in his late 40s, came to stay at Tranby Croft, a large new country house near Hull, belonging to a shipping millionaire named Arthur Wilson. This was the machinery of the late Victorian upper world, the great house, the shooting, the races at Doncaster, the long evenings to be filled. The prince filled his with baccarat, a fast card game of pure chance that he loved and that happened to be illegal in England, a foreign vice, played in private, winked at because the heir to the throne enjoyed it. He traveled with his own set of leather counters, marked with his feathers, a gift from a banking friend. When he wanted to play, his hosts found him a table. On the night of the 8th of September, the guests pushed 3 mismatched card tables together, threw a cloth over them, and played. And during the play, the host's son, Stanley Wilson, sitting close, thought he saw something. He thought he saw Gordon Cumming, after the cards had fallen in his favor, quietly add to the money already staked, increasing a winning bet after it had already won. He said nothing aloud. He told the others, and they agreed, with the awful calm of people who believe they already know the answer, to watch him the next night. Before we go on into that second night, and into the trap it became, let me say plainly that this channel exists to take you back inside worlds like this one, and let you stand in them honestly, without the conspiracy and the invented drama that fills so much history online. If that's the kind of company you want to keep, subscribe, and stay close. The real story is strange enough. The second night, the 9th, they were ready for him. This time, before play, a chalk line was drawn across the green baize, 6 inches from the edge, and the players were told to keep their counters behind it except when actually placing a stake. The line was a test. It would make any movement of money across it visible, and it tells you everything about the temperature of that house, that the men around the table could sit, smiling, passing the cards, while a line had been drawn in chalk, specifically to catch one of their own. The prince dealt as banker. When Gordon Cumming came to the table, the only seats left placed him surrounded by Wilsons, every one of whom had been told what to look for. By the end of that second evening, 4 or 5 of them were convinced. The host's daughter and her husband, the son, the mother, all believed they had watched Sir William Gordon Cumming cheat. The next morning they did not go to the police, because there was no question of police. They went to the prince, and the prince, faced with a scandal that could drag his own illegal game into the open, did what his world did with such things. He had it handled privately. They drafted a document. In exchange for the silence of everyone present, silence about the accusation, which would protect the prince as much as anyone, Gordon Cumming was asked to sign a single sentence. He signed it, still denying, flatly and bitterly, that he had done anything wrong. It read, that in consideration of their promise to keep silent, he would solemnly undertake never to play cards again, as long as I live. Read that again, and let the strangeness of it land. Not never to play here, not never to play with us, never to play cards again, as long as he lived. A lifetime sentence for a card game signed in a drawing room, witnessed by the future king, with no judge, no jury, no charge, and no appeal. He signed it because the alternative, exposure, was, to him, worse than the surrender. He thought the paper would bury the thing. It did the opposite. It was the confession his enemies needed. And here is where you have to ask the question this whole story is built around. The question that makes their behavior stop looking like madness. Why? Why would these people destroy a friend of 20 years over 200 pounds and a card game? They were rich. The money was nothing. The game was illegal anyway, so the moral high ground was hardly theirs. So why? The answer is that they did not believe they were punishing a card game. They believed they were punishing a broken word. And to men of that class, a man's word was not one of his possessions. It was the whole of him. Their entire world ran on it. There were no contracts at the card table, no referees, no cameras. A gentleman's standing rested on a single assumption, that his word could be trusted absolutely, that he would not lie, would not cheat, would not take what was not his when no one could stop him. Cards were where that assumption was tested in public, with money on the table and no authority watching but each other. That was the whole point of playing. A man who would cheat his friends at cards, for money he did not even need, had proven that the assumption was false, that his word was worth nothing, anywhere, ever again. He had not committed a small crime. He had revealed himself to be, underneath the uniform and the title, hollow. And a hollow man could not be received, could not be dined with, could not be trusted near your wife or your money or your name, so you cut him off. Not in anger, in something closer to hygiene. That is the logic. It is brutal, and it is internally complete, and once you see it, you cannot unsee how a chalk line on a card table could be a guillotine. The pledge did not hold. Within weeks, the story was moving through London drawing rooms. Someone had talked. Gordon Cumming heard that he was being discussed in his own clubs, that the secrecy he had bought with his signature had already been spent. His clubs began to close to him. His regiment began to ask questions. He wrote to the prince's friends. He wrote to the prince himself. The prince declined to meet him, and so the man did the only thing left to a man who believes the alternative is to accept a guilt he denies. He sued. He issued writs against 5 of the accusers for slander, dragging the whole private affair, and the prince along with it, into open court. If you are listening this far, sit for a moment with the choice he made, because it is the hinge of the entire story. He had a signed paper promising him silence. If he stayed quiet, the thing might fade. By going to court, he guaranteed that every newspaper in the country would print the accusation in full. He bet his name on a public verdict. Would you have signed that paper in the first place? And then, having signed it, would you have torn the silence open to clear it? Tell me below. I genuinely want to know where you'd have stood in that room. The trial opened on the 1st of June, 1891, and it was the sensation of the age. Entry was by ticket. The Prince of Wales, heir to the throne, was called to the witness box and made to admit, in public, that he had played an illegal game and had not reported a fellow officer's alleged cheating as army regulations required. The newspapers were merciless to him, but the heir to the throne would survive a bad fortnight in the press. Gordon Cumming would not survive the verdict. The jury found against him. In the eyes of the law and the public, the accusation stood. He had cheated. And the punishment that followed was the punishment the code demanded, swift and total. He was dismissed from the army the same day. He was expelled from his clubs. The doors of society shut in a single motion. The next morning he married his American fiancée, Florence Garner, and withdrew to his Scottish estate, Gordonstoun, the house that would, decades later, become the famous school. He was not yet 43, and his life among his own people was over. He lived almost 40 more years, on his land, in a kind of internal exile, and he stayed bitter to the end of them. Not one of his close friends spoke to him again, though a few softened, the records suggest, only after the prince himself had died and become King Edward, and then died again, as if the friendship could not be resumed, while the man who had presided over the ruin still drew breath. His own barrister, one of the finest lawyers in England, wrote years later that he had always believed the verdict was wrong and his client innocent. We cannot settle that now. The witnesses saw what they saw. The jury decided what it decided. The truth of those 2 nights went into the ground with the men who were at the table. What we can say is simpler and stranger, and the whole reason his story still unsettles. Whether or not he moved a single counter across that chalk line, the machine that destroyed him needed no proof we would recognize. It needed only the belief, among his friends, that his word was no longer good. The rest was automatic. We think of the parlor, the card table, the after-dinner game as the safest, softest corner of the old world, the place where nothing serious could happen. For a man like Gordon Cumming, it was the most dangerous room in the house. Everywhere else, the law decided your fate, slowly, with evidence. There, your friends decided it, in an evening, on a suspicion. And once they had decided, there was no court above them to appeal to. They were the court, they always had been.